If you would, open up to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. As we've started this study and continued through, we've seen creation at God's voice. We've seen what God prepared for man and woman, a place of delight. And then yet to see man go against God's one command and completely spoil what was delightful. And then to be driven out of the garden, a guard to be set so they could not go back in. Then as they had children, two sons in particular, Cain and Abel, you find that Cain gets angry and he will not control his anger. And his anger rages to the point of taking his brother's life. And I think if anger is not kept in check and not mastered, it will destroy and set on fire your own life. That's exactly what happened with Cain. As God passed his judgment against Cain, you may remember, all of a sudden, the fear and the worry and the anxiety and the shame all come within in terms of spiritual death, whether it was Adam or Eve, or whether we're talking about Cain. And Cain said, "This punishment is too great for me." He says, "I can't bear it." And God placed upon him a sign that was known to them, unknown to us, where if anybody saw Cain, they knew that they were not to kill him, which is kind of interesting because at the time the population of earth was only 3 after Abel had been killed. But yet in the days and really in the years to come, of course, it would grow tremendously. If you notice in Genesis chapter 4, look at verse 16. It says, "Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden." It's kind of interesting that still using Eden as a location point of going, Eden is here, but he is not there. And literally the Hebrew word for Nod means a wandering. And so when you stop and put it together, leaving the presence of the Lord, I want you to think how often people do that. When you think about leaving God's presence, what do you think of leaving behind? Salvation? Peace? Light in terms of walking by light? Truth? Hope? And yet, what was that? Safety? And so, to realize this is what happens. He went out from the presence of the Lord and he settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And to think of all these things willingly being given up because of his own choices. Then verse 17. And beginning in verse 17 through verse 24, we're going to get the genealogy of Cain. It's not going to give you the number of years they lived. It's not going to give you really a whole lot of detail about most of them, except for a few things along the way. And I want you to kind of notice as these things lay out, it'll build over the course of these things. You'll see 8 generations from Adam all the way down to Cain and all the way on down to a man by the name of Lamech. Verse 17 says, Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son. What really pokes out at you in verse 17? Where did he find the wife? Well, we'll answer that question here in a little bit. It's going to talk about how that Adam and Eve had many other sons and daughters. So there's only one man that was made. We're all descendant from one man. You can read about that in Romans. But here, he says, Cain had relations with his wife. I know for us, we think, his sister? This sounds crazy. But to realize, here's what God has set in order. And if you think in those terms of seeing how God created everything and every creature, we think in terms of genetics, to make Adam and Eve genetically in a way to where whenever they reproduce, they're made for each other.
So at that time, they really had no choice.
Right. No other choice.
Early too, so it's like
Definitely so. And it really doesn't give you a time frame with Cain. We're going to get time frames whenever we start looking down Seth's lineage. But it just tells you a point in time. So Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son. So Cain actually establishes a place. Remember, he's going to be a vagrant and a wanderer. And yet he establishes this place east of Eden in Nod. And he builds this city, and he calls it after his own son. Sounds very typical of what we do even now, doesn't it? Now, notice how it continues, verse 18. Notice these generations. Now we're really going to start to stack them up pretty quick. Verse 18. Now to Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael became the father of Methushael, and Methushael became the father of Lamech. Did I do okay? All right. So you start to notice generations are really starting to rack up pretty quick. It's not giving you really any information about any of these people, except for this is the lineage that you found through Cain. Then, we're going to get down to Lamech, and Lamech is the seventh from Adam down through Cain. So, notice it's going to give a little more detail about Lamech, and use this as foreshadowing for what's coming in chapter 6. Because take a good hard look at Lamech. Verse 19. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zilhah. What do you see happen for the first time? 2 wives. Now, just a side thought. Whenever God made the woman for the man, he just made him one wife, right? And to go, you see what God had in order, and yet to understand, look at what man's going to do. Now, later on, whenever we get to the Moses giving the law, God is going to give them the right to have 2 wives. But there is a big commandment that goes with it. You have to treat them evenly. If you build a brand new house for one wife, you also have to build a brand new house for your second wife. And of course, those things are going to go away at the end of the Old Covenant. But at this point in time, he takes 2 wives. The name of the one is Ada, the name of the other is Zilhah. Now it's going to give some more information about their children together. In other words, Lamech with Ada and Lamech with Zilhah. Verse 20. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. What do you see starting to happen? Occupation. You see, it's kind of nomadic people, right? All of a sudden you see tents. Now keep in mind, whenever we're dealing with Lamech and Ada's children, we're on the 8th generation from Adam. So quite a bit of time here. Notice here, he says, dwell in tents, have livestock, verse 21. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. What's coming around now? Music. Now, isn't it kind of interesting to think you would get 8 generations from Adam before you really got anything like this? I mean, we kind of feel like music's just a part of what happens on a daily basis. For them to think this wasn't part of their world. And so you start to notice through these descendants that come through Cain, to go, all right, man, playing the lyre, lyre's like a harp, and the pipe, I don't know if that comes along the idea of like a flute type instrument or something along those lines, maybe a recorder type situation, I don't know exactly. But verse 22, as for Zilhah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Notice what's coming around now in the 8th generation from Adam. What are they able to do now? They're working with metals. And you think about a metalsmith, and by the way, you see the name Tubal-Cain? Cain is actually the Hebrew word for a smith, or someone who works with and makes metals and works in things along those lines. And so the idea here is a forger of all implements, and notice it says all implements of bronze and iron. And if you're forging them, what are you doing with them? Yeah, you're working with it. I mean, this is about melting things down. I mean, if you're going to make iron, think about mixing things together. You think in terms of to be able to forge and to mold and to shape and to make, and you realize this is pretty advanced things. I mean, just think on the top of your head, however good you are with science and technology and things, and go, if somebody just said, hey, I want you to forge me a sword, how long would it take you to figure that out? And by the way, you get no instructions off of YouTube or the internet. And you realize, and you have to figure out, number one, how to ore things out, how to dig for them, how to find them, how to refine them. I mean, realize you can understand why this would take quite some time to figure out. That's not something you go, oh yeah, that's easy stuff. Richard.
Seems like in secular history, if you know, they say there's a Bronze Age, Iron Age. So
A little interesting, they both came together. Right. So that's a good point. Then he says, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Now, Naamah is the Hebrew word for sweetness. I want to think she was a sweet gal, but I don't know. But at least that's what she's named. And to go, here they are. And so it describes these 4 children of Lamech. Now, here's where we're going to really get down to it. Look at verse 23. I'm going to read verses 23 and 24. You tell me your impression of Lamech as a man. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. What do you think about Lamech?
He's praising himself.
Praising himself. What else? He's very full of vengeance. Very violent.
Takes after his father.
Well, it takes after all the way back to Cain, which is, you're still some 6 generations away from there. Here's something I want you to really kind of notice. Who are these words aimed at? His wives. And notice, do you hear the threatening in this? I mean, notice what it says. It says, Adah and Zillah, specifically talking to his 2 wives. It's not about talking to their children. It says, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give heed to my speech. What do you hear in that? You better listen to me. And then, after you better listen to me, what does he describe next? I've killed a man for what? For wounding me, and I've also killed a boy for just striking me. So you better listen, or isn't that what you hear in it? I mean, you go, does this sound evil to you? I mean, does he not sound like he's been mastered by sin? That he's already killed 2 people. And on top of that, his 2 wives that he has, he's threatening to them. Now, if you notice in verse 24, he says, if Cain is avenged 70-fold, he says, I'm going to be 11 times as much. I'm going to be 77. Now, do you hear within this how wicked it has become in the 8th generation from Cain? I mean, and if you notice, it hasn't given us a whole lot of details about folks up to this point. I mean, after the story of Cain and Abel. But what you're finding out, what's being revealed, is how evil it has become. Right? Now, these are the descendants of Cain. So, is it going to be any different when we come to the descendants that come through another son of Cain and Abel? Now, You think, here's 8 generations from Adam, through Cain, all the way down to Lamech, and you see how wicked it is. And there's definitely some foreshadowing here for this big flood that's coming in chapter 6, or it's going to be talked about in chapter 6. And so realize, and we're going to get to some language in chapter 6 where there's actually a verse in there that I don't know how to make it any worse. It's that bad. Now, notice on the other side of the branch of this tree that comes out of Adam and Eve. Verse 25. Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. Were Adam and Eve aware of what happened with Cain and Abel? Certainly so, because the whole reason that they named this son Seth is saying, he is taking the place. God has appointed for me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. Now, here's really some gut-wrenching thoughts as a parent. Who introduced sin into this place? They did. Adam and Eve introduced sin into the world. And now to see what their sin has turned into, now it's been learned by the second generation in Cain and Abel to where Cain kills Abel. So that whenever they have a third son named Seth, they call him Seth because he's going to take Abel's place. Abel was our righteous son. He was our good son. I don't want to put anything there, but to realize Seth's going to come and he's going to take his place. Now, notice what else it brings up in verse 26. To Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, just so that you don't get the two confused, look back in chapter 4 at verse 17. Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Now, there's going to be a different Enoch that's going to show up in chapter 5, so don't get them confused. But now that we get down to verse 26, and it says, to Seth, to him also was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. Don't get this one confused with Cain's son. Just realize they're two different people. Here's something else. He says, and you realize, it's just talked about the 8th generation from Adam through Cain with Lamech. Now it's going to back it up on the other side with Seth. And we're going back, I mean, this is 6 generations, 5 or 6 generations going backward in time. So feel like it just gave you the rundown of Cain's descendants, and I said, okay, let's go back to Seth now. We've talked enough about that. Now let's go back to Seth. So when you get to verse 26, Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. All of a sudden, things are getting different. Whenever Adam and Eve were in the garden, didn't they have face-to-face conversations with God? Whenever Cain was thinking about what he was going to do with Abel, didn't God talk to Cain? Maybe face-to-face isn't the exact right way to say it, but a personal interaction, let's just put it that way. Is that still going on now that we're another generation out? Not here. But notice, what are they doing? We're calling on the name of the Lord. And what do you typically think of when you hear that phrase? Relationship and praise and prayer, perhaps. Chuck? Right. And you go, we've got to go all the way back here to Seth before we can talk about this. And you start to see how wicked the descendants of Cain are, all the way down, even to tell you about Lamech. I mean, just a wicked man. Now, look at chapter 5 and look at verse 1. So now we work our way through, and he's going to start to build this family tree, if you want to talk about it in one way, but really it's the descendants of Seth. Now notice chapter 5, verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, that's our bara word, He says, he made, there's the asa form, shape. He made him in the likeness of God. So notice, this is the same language as what we got back in chapter 1, right? Created, made in the likeness of God, verse 2. He created, there's bara again, to create something out of nothing. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. He says, and there's a blessing for them. And you realize, here was a blessing for them. Do you remember what the blessing was? Look back at Genesis chapter 1. Look at verses 27 and 28. Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Exact same language we were reading in chapter 5. Verse 28. God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Guess what you're about to read about in Genesis chapter 5? They are about to be fruitful and multiply, and they're going to fill the earth. And who blessed them in doing it? God did. Now, so come back over here to Genesis chapter 5. So in verse 2, he says, he blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. Verse 3, when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. 130 years from the creation week until the time that Seth is born. All right, can anybody in here fathom 130 years, or have we already gone over everybody's head? I mean, you start to think, all right, we got some folks here tonight who are in their 90s, but at the same time, when you start thinking in terms of 130. Now, yeah, and you start to notice here, notice kind of this picture as it goes through 130 years, and notice what does it point out about Seth? Whose likeness is he in? Adam's in. And whose image is Adam in? God's. You see this getting handed down. Being made in the image of God didn't stop with just man and woman, or Adam and Eve, did it? Because if you remember what we looked at last week in looking at in James chapter 3, where it talked about, you can't bless God with your mouth and then curse man who's made in his image. Man's still made in God's image? Or did that just stop in the very beginning few generations? Still made in his image, right?
Yeah, well, you think the physical appearance of people back then must have been totally different.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely so. You think in whatever way that God genetically put man and woman together to be able to get such a wide array of differences than what we see now. And later on when we get to Noah, it's a lot easier when you get 8 people. So you can kind of see some things there. But anyway, whenever you stop and take this in, look at verse 4. Then the days of Adam after he became the father of Seth were 800 years. Does 800 years hit anybody? I mean, 800 years. The nation we live in is not even 250 years old yet. And we think, oh, we've been here a while. No, not really. Not really at all. Here's the other aspect of this, and you're going to see this same phrase after each one of these. Verse 4, and he had other sons and daughters. So it wasn't just they had Cain, Abel, and Seth. After them, they also had other sons and daughters. At the very minimum, we're talking about 2 more sons and 2 more daughters, but it doesn't say that that's the minimum either. It's just giving you an idea. Many other sons and daughters. You remember what the judgment against Eve was for partaking of the fruit? Pain in childbearing. And you talk about difficulty. I mean, she's not just going to go through that 3 times with Cain, Abel, and Seth. She's going to go through that at least 4 more times, and perhaps many, many, many more. I mean, do you think she regretted what she did? Oh, man. Oh, man. Now, here's something else for you. In verse 5, it says, so all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. 930 years. Now, depending on how long Eve lived, I mean, Adam and Eve could have celebrated how many anniversaries? I mean, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds. I mean, you talk about, typically nowadays we talk about till death do us part. Well, they didn't know anything about death. Whenever they got married on the first day, for them, and to go, they literally thought they'd be together forever. Chuck?
Certainly building an idea that there's a lot more caution with Adam and Eve and in the line of Seth that's being exercised in relation to God than what Cain and his line did.
Right. And if you notice how it goes back and talks about in verse 2, he blessed them. Notice this is about a blessing. Ken, do you have something to say?
Okay, where in the Bible does it talk about, people like us who live, Jimmy Carter's 100 years old, and there are centenarians that live 200, but where in the Bible does it start to get to where people are living like we are and what caused it?
It'll come just really about 2 or 3 generations after the flood is where you'll start to see that. But let's deal with this first. 930 years, does that sound like a long time to you? I mean, here's what I want you to consider. So many times people think their way through this and go, man, how could people live that long? And we start to kind of grasp at straws like, well, they were vegetarian. Well, they're vegetarians today and they're not living that long. I mean, you might think in terms of, well, maybe they didn't have as many diseases, and we kind of get off in the weeds, but let's really get down to the facts. Look over at Psalm 139, and I'll show you why they lived that long. Psalm 139. Look at verse 13. Here's what David says. He says, "For you formed my inward parts, you wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you, and I was made in secret, and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them." Tell me, how did those people live to be 930 years old? Because God ordained it. And He wrote it in His book before they were even born. People want to come up with all kinds of different theories on how come, why was it that way then, and you realize there's really only one answer. Because God said they would. That's why they lived that long. And whenever God wanted to shorten it, He shortened it. And He didn't ordain as many days later. But to realize, who stands in complete control of this creation? The Creator, God. Right, and they also needed time to populate the earth. And so you realize, you see what God's doing here. Because of His blessing, we got to have time to populate the earth. And sure enough, here's where things go. If you look back at Genesis chapter 5, it starts to pull things through. I want you to kind of look at the handout. Hopefully everybody's got one. We'll kind of use the manna principle. If you don't have one, you can raise your hand and look around for somebody who's got two. And maybe they'll share one with you if you need one. If you're watching on YouTube, there's links to these in the description below the video. You can pause the video anytime you want and go down and print them off. So, if you notice on the side, if you look at the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5, if you notice the way it's set up, it's going to talk about the name of the individual. It's going to talk about the age they are when they give birth to their first son, the name of the son, and then how many years they lived after, and then the total number of years they lived on earth. It's going to go down through this for really about 11 generations between Adam and Noah. And in doing that, you start to fill in these numbers as they go, and you can actually calculate how many years there were from Adam to the flood. And you can know it to the year, which is really amazing. On the other side, if you notice the kind of the bar chart, you start to see not life expectancy, but the length of life for the different patrons that are talked about here in Genesis chapter 5. And if you notice, with the way that things are coming together, I think it's about 5 years before Enoch is taken up to God. From Enoch, about those 5 years before he's taken up, each of the generations before him is still alive. And that would also include the times that go all the way down to another man by the name of Lamech, not the one we just looked at with Cain's descendant, but another. And realize, whenever Lamech is in his 50th year, there are all 9 generations that are previous to him are still alive. Now, I've got that written out for you on the bottom side here, on the other side. And you can actually see their ages at the time. Most of them are within, some of them are within just a few years of the end of their time on earth. But here's the aspect that I really want you to consider. Well, as we'll go down through here, we'll point out some things. What it would be like to have 9 generations on the planet at one time. What would that do to what you learned? Would that help you? Can you imagine going, look, here's a nice trick that I learned. And to go, you can hand that down. There's some flip sides to that too. I wonder how many women asked Eve after they gave birth to these children, why did you do it? I want you to think about how many men that were just a sweaty mess who asked Adam, why did you do it? God told you not to do it. And at the same time, what Adam and Eve see happening on the planet, that now that sin is going on, even on the opposite side of the tree, in the descendants of Cain, of going, this is what we ushered in. This is what we brought in. Can you imagine having to deal with 9 generations worth of problems that you started? You realize, boy, you talk about something to endure. Chuck.
It would certainly facilitate the understanding of the movement of the stars being able to live that way.
Yeah, you certainly would understand a lot of the different things that happened so many years. I mean, I'm not saying they did this, but you think about Halley's Comet comes around every 75 years and going, yeah, I've already seen that thing like 10 times. But, you know, you start to think through in all the years that are there, how things become a little bit different in terms of, can you imagine going through harvest that many years? You imagine in terms of the learning the different skills that you would pick up along the way. Now, notice how this continues, and we're going to move through some of these kind of fast. Verse 6, Seth lived 105 years and became the father of Enosh. Then Seth lived 807 years after he became the father of Enosh. And he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. To think, for Seth, he lives a long time. I mean, 912, we're still in those 900 range. Verse 9, Enosh lived 90 years and became the father of Kenan. Now, he's considered to be kind of young when he has his first child. You know, he's kind of starting off early, you know. I don't know if they thought that or not. But he says, Enosh lived 90 years, became the father of Kenan. Then Enosh lived 815 years after he became the father of Kenan. He had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. Now, I want you to realize this genealogy that we're looking at is only looking really at one section of all these descendants, because with each descendant, there's other sons and daughters. So you're only really looking at one bloodline as it comes through, while this tree is getting much, much bigger with what's not being mentioned, except for other sons and daughters. Notice how it continues. Then, verse 12. Kenan lived 70 years, became the father of Mahalalel. By the way, Mahalalel means praise of God. So, what does that tell you about Kenan? Who is he aware of? God. So much to the fact that he wants to name his son Mahalalel. Praise of God. Isn't that kind of interesting? Now, notice how he continues. He says, he had other sons and daughters, so all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. Verse 15. Mahalalel lived 65 years and became the father of Jared. Then Mahalalel lived 830 years and became the father of Jared, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. I mean, if you notice, things are moving relatively quick, but at the same time, you're just adding a generation to what's already there. I know within our own family, we've had a time where you could get a picture and get 4 generations. And to think, can you imagine having a time of just having 9 generations together at once? And we haven't gotten that far yet. But just to consider what that would mean, I mean, we have a family reunion picture, and it only has like 4 generations in it, but there's like 80 people there. And that's just one family, and not everybody had, 5 or 6 or 8 kids. So you realize how quickly this thing is growing. Be fruitful and multiply. They said, we got that. Then, verse 18, Jared lived 162 years and became the father of Enoch. Then Jared lived 800 years, and he became the father of Enoch, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Now, all of a sudden, Enoch shows up, and things are going to be a little unique here. Verse 21. Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. That's a name you're probably familiar with for just one reason probably, but there should be more. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enosh were 365 years. Wow. That's incredibly what? Short. I mean, everybody else is living to 930, 912, 905, 910, 895, 962, and then you get a 365? If you didn't know the description, what would you think about him? What did he do wrong? But it's just the opposite, isn't it? What did he do? He walked with God. And if you notice what it says here in verse 24, he says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And God just takes Enoch. And you see this special relationship between God and Enoch. And once again noting, man, here's such a unique thing going on here. Look over in the New Testament. Look at Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Look at verse 5. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. That's the purpose. He didn't have to endure death. Wow. Isn't that something? I mean, we think about the wages of sin is death. I'm not saying he was perfect, but going, in whatever way he walked with God, God said, you don't have to go through the dying process. He says, so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. Notice it say he was not found. What does that tell you people were doing? Somebody's looking, right? He says, for he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. And why was he pleasing to God? Faith. You see this faith response to God. He's pleasing before God. I want you to point out something else about Enoch. Look over at the book of Jude. Look at the book of Jude. Look down at verses 14 and 15. You may be thinking as you kind of look through this worksheet of going, you're saying that there's all these generations, but so many times I've heard that these genealogies just skip generations and don't tell you about those kind of things. Well, you should be really happy about the book of Jude then. Look at verse 14. It was also about these men that Enoch, in the 7th generation from, you want to go ahead and count or you want me to? If you start with Adam as 1, guess what Enoch's going to be? He's going to be 7th. So what does that tell you? Any skip generations here? Nope. He says, prophesied saying, behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. What kind of judgment was coming? And who is it going to be against? It's going to be against the wicked and the ungodly. And those who spoke against who? God himself. You want to speak against God? What are you going to bring on yourself? Judgment. Now, you notice here, this is what Enoch wrote about. It's what he prophesied about. He didn't necessarily write it down, but he prophesied about it, about a judgment that was coming. Now, anybody want to take a guess at what kind of judgment he was really talking about? Maybe it goes as far as the flood, but maybe there was a judgment before. I really don't know which way to take that. So I'll leave that up to you. Come back over to Genesis chapter 5. So you see that Enoch had a special relationship with God. In walking with God, God said, you're not going to die. Then I want you to notice what comes next. This is kind of the old little trivia question that I stumped the proud on, of going, who died first, Methuselah or his father? Methuselah's the oldest man to ever live, but his father never died. If you ever get somebody arrogant, just go ahead and ask them, see if they pass the test. Now, notice what else is here. Verse 25, Methuselah lived 187 years and became the father of Lamech. Then Methuselah lived 782 years after he became the father of Lamech, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. What is Methuselah known for? The oldest man to ever live, 969 years old. Now, here's something that I want you to see on this little bar graph. If you notice, this arrow is when the flood happened. And I'll go ahead and tell you, if you add up this column with all the ages of which they had their first son, you're going to come up, Noah's going to be 500, Noah's going to be another 100 years after that when he's 600 when the flood comes. So the number is going to be 1,656 years from the creation week to the year that it flooded with Noah. Here's what I want you to think about, though. If you notice, it says Methuselah's lifespan goes right up to that arrow. And if you notice right underneath him, with Lamech, he actually comes just within a few years. He dies right before the flood comes. And if you just look at the numbers, you might go, man, did Methuselah die in the year of the flood, or was he wicked and taken away with the flood? And if you start asking yourself those kind of questions, you may come to the conclusion I did once upon a time and go, I guess we'll never know. And I was wrong. Because we do know. You want to know what the name Methuselah means in Hebrew? When he is dead, it shall be sent. It shall be sent. When he is dead, it shall be sent. There's a judgment that was coming. And who would know to name their son Methuselah? A man who walked with God and prophesied for God. And so you realize he dies, and then within the year, the flood comes. Isn't that something? Now, notice how this continues. Verse 28. Lamech lived 182 years and became the father of a son. Now he called his name Noah, saying, this one will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed. What Noah was going to bring was going to change what? A curse that began when? In the garden, after they sinned. Remember the curse that was put on the ground? What Noah's coming was going to change that, which is just wonderful if you're going to be a farmer. Now, notice, and if you're going to eat, verse 30. Then Lamech lived 595 years after he became the father of Noah, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died, because Lamech dies a few years before the flood comes. Verse 32. Noah was 500 years old, and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Triplets. How about that? You'll see how that works out maybe next week. All right. Hopefully we made sense of the genealogy, learned a few things along the way, and realized, wow, these things are multiplying fast. Have a great rest of your week.